With the class, what we have before us this day is physiology of deglutition. Deglutition is a process by which the food bolus is propelled from the oral cavity into the stomach. It is a process or art by which the food bolus is propelled uh, from the mouth through the pharynx and the esophagus into the stomach. It is a smooth, coordinated process, typically divided into three distinct phases: the oral, pharyngeal, and the esophageal phases. The oral phase deals with activity that surrounds the movement or the transit of the food through the mouth into the pharynx, while the pharyngeal phase deals with the activity and mechanism involved in the traveling or movement of the food bolus through the pharynx into the esophagus. The esophageal phase um, um, involves the activity that propel the food through the esophagus into the stomach. All right, let's take a look at the first phase, the oral phase. The oral phase is a voluntary phase. The oral phase is a voluntary phase. It has two phases. In other words, it is subdivided into two phases. Number one, the preparative phase. Number two, the propulsive phase. The oral preparative phase refers to how the food bolus is positioned on the middle of the tongue in preparation for swallowing. This process involves the coordinated contractions of the tongue and the skeletal muscles of mastication. While the oral propulsive phase propels the food bolus after it has been positioned in the middle of the tongue into the oropharynx. It begins with depression and retraction of the tip of the tongue, and also the elevation and the retraction of the posterior part of the tongue against the hard palate. The consequent effect of all these events is that a pressure is generated that pushes the food bolus into the pharynx. The pharyngeal phase. The pharyngeal phase is involuntary and is totally reflexive, and that will mean that swallowing reflex is required for pharyngeal activity to occur. The swallowing reflex lasts approximately about 1 second. The receptor for swallowing reflex are touch receptors located mostly on the palate and near the opening of the pharynx. Sensory impulses or afferent impulses are sends send through the trigeminal, glossopharyngeal, and vagus nerve to the uh, swallowing center where they are integrated. The swallowing center is located in the medulla and the pons. They are the nucleus stratus and the nucleus what? Ambiguous. From the swallowing center, efferent impulses are uh, in turn sent to the pharyngeal muscles and the tongue via the trigeminal, facial, and apoglossal nerve. During pharyngeal phase, respiration ceases. This is termed as deglutition apnea. It will be good to know that pharyngeal phase is the shortest and is the most complex. You may want to know why the pharyngeal phase is complex. The pharyngeal phase is complex because the oropharynx is in communication with the nasopharynx, the air passages, and the esophagus. The oropharynx is in communication with the nasal cavity through the nasopharynx, is in communication with the airways and also with the esophagus. So, therefore, several protective reflexes are needed to guide the food bolus away from the nasal passages and the airways into the what? And eventually into the what? Esophagus. That is why the pharyngeal phase is what? Is complex. Okay. The next slide, I will be taking you through how the food bolus is guided away from the nasal cavity, the airways, and now it is guided into the what? Esophagus. Okay. Before I go to this pharyngeal phase, let me use this slide to show you how the oropharynx is in communication with the ear passages, the esophagus, and the nasopharynx. Okay, this is the oropharynx, and you can see it's in communication with the nasopharynx, leading to the nasal cavity. It's also in communication with the what? With the airways. This is the airways here through the laryngopharynx. That's the junction between the pharynx and the larynx here. And it's also in communication with the what? With the esophagus. So the complexity is to ensure that these food bolus do not move into the nasal cavity, and it also should not move into the airways here, but should be guided into the what? Esophagus. All right. Okay. How is the food guided away from the nasal cavity? The entrance of the food bolus into the oropharynx stimulates mechanoreceptors in the oropharynx. Consequently, the nasopharynx is reflexly what? Closed through the contraction of the what? Superior constrictor muscles of the pharynx, and the elevation of the soft palate and its uvular extension towards the pharyngeal wall. Okay, let me use to explain what I've just said. I said the entrance of the food bolus, this is the food bolus, into the oropharynx stimulates mechanoreceptors that are located there, leading to contraction of the superior constrictor muscle of the pharynx. The pharynx has three. We have the superior, inferior, and the superior, middle, and inferior constrictor muscle. So the entrance of the food bolus into the oropharynx stimulates the mechanoreceptors, leading to constriction of the uh, superior constrictor muscle. The contraction of the superior constrictor muscle of the pharynx elevates the soft palate. See the soft palate here. To elevate the soft palate and is uvular what extension towards the pharyngeal wall. This pharyngeal wall. You can see this is already in an elevated what position. And as you can see, that has closed up what the nasal cavity away from what the food what bolus. All right. Okay. Also, how is the food bolus guided away from the airways? How is the food bolus guided away from the airways? And also how it is guided into the esophagus. All right. The constriction of the um, superior constrictor muscle as a result of activation of the mechanoreceptors on the oropharynx also lead to upward and forward movements of the larynx. That is, the larynx is raised and moved forward. Respiration ceases. The vocal cords approximate through the contraction of the laryngeal muscle. Consequently, the glottis closes. The epiglottis is pushed backward as a lead over the glottis. The consequent effect of that is that the airways is closed, preventing the food bolus entering into it. Okay, let me use this to also explain what I've said. Okay, I said the larynx is raised. The larynx here. It's not yet raised here, but it has been raised here. The larynx is raised, okay, and move forward. Raised up, move forward, and the vocal cords, they are the ones in black colors here. The vocal cords approximate, they come together, and when they come together, the glottis, that's the spacing between them, closes. The epiglottis is the one here, is pushed backward as a lead over the glottis. And the implication of that, as you can see, is that the food bolus is prevented from entering into the into the airways. How is the food bolus guided into the esophagus? Okay, the up and forward movement of the larynx stretches the opening of the esophagus. Stretches the opening of the esophagus, and the implication of that is that the esophagus is opened so as to allow the food bolus into it, moving into it. Okay, the bolus is propelled through the pharynx by peristaltic waves which begins with the contraction of the superior constrictor muscle and progresses down through the contraction of the middle and inferior constrictor muscles of the pharynx. The peristalsis relaxes the upper esophageal sphincter, thereby making the bolus to enter into the esophagus. Okay, let me use this also to explain what I've just said. Okay, like I said, the up and forward movement of this is the larynx. When it moves up and moves forward, okay, it will stretch the opening of the esophagus. It will enlarge it, and that is a way of creating room, okay, or making room for the entrance of the bolus. Okay, and also the food bolus is propelled from the pharynx into the this is my marker, into the, oh my god, into the esophagus down there. That's down there, blue here. The food bolus is propelled into the esophagus by the peristalsis, which actually began with the constriction or contraction of the superior constrictor muscle and progresses down by the contraction of the middle and inferior constrictor muscles of the pharynx. The same peristaltic waves relaxes the upper esophageal sphincter. The upper esophageal sphincter is the gateway into the esophagus. That sphincter is usually closed, but when the peristaltic waves gets to the sphincter, it relaxes. And when it relaxes, it opens up, allowing the food bolus to enter into the esophagus. Okay, of course, after the food bolus enters the esophagus, the upper esophageal sphincter contracts behind it, and then it closes the esophagus. Okay, what now happens with the food bolus in the esophagus? And that will take us to the esophageal phase. Okay, the esophageal phase is also an involuntary phase. It is a phase where the food transits through the esophagus into the stomach. Now, the movement of the food bolus from the esophagus into the stomach is carried out by two waves: the primary peristaltic waves and the secondary peristalsis waves. The primary peristaltic waves sweeps the contents of the esophagus in 10 seconds into the stomach. All right, but when the primary peristaltic wave fails to empty the esophagus, the secondary peristalsis is initiated through the what at the point of distension of what of the esophagus by its contents that remains after the peristaltic what waves. As the food approaches the lower esophageal sphincter, that's the second gate, the gate out of the esophagus. As the food approaches the lower esophageal sphincter, the lower esophageal sphincter relaxes, thereby allowing the food to move from the esophagus into the what? Into the stomach. That marks complete the whole phase of swallowing, moving the food bolus from the mouth through the pharynx and the esophagus into the what? Into the stomach. Good day.